I think we should now hear from Giulio Napolitano and then have Sabino Cassese answer in whatever he would like the various questions that have been asked so that we can put it together. I might even have a question myself.
Did the Constitution work properly in its 63 years of life? Did it perform worse or better than the Statuto Albertino? Did it represent a change, a radical change in comparison to the Statuto, or on the contrary, it was simply a prosecution of it, even if in a different historical and political context? Sabino Cassese's lecture provided, according to me, a powerful manifesto against any form of constitutional rhetoric or religion. Cassese very clearly reminded us the many failures and delays in the implementation of the constitutional design of 1948. And he underlined the long-term imperfections in the building up of a strong and effective executive from the Statuto to the present Constitution. In my comment, I would like to address the same questions raised by Sabino in a broader perspective. My argument is that the role of the Constitution can be usefully assessed putting into relation the institutional and the political machinery with the transformations of citizenship and society, and vice versa. First of all, just speaking in general terms, I think we must recognize and we cannot forget what happened in Italy in the last 60 years under the rule of the Constitution. Peace and democracy were enhanced and defended. The greatest economic development in the Italian history was achieved. Individual liberties and social rights were recognized and expanded at levels unknown in the past. Of course, not all these achievements can be considered as an output or as an exclusive merit of the Constitution enacted in 1948. Nonetheless, I think that these achievements were remarkable and that they were favored by the enactment of the Constitution. All these achievements were remarkable because each of them was not easily forecastable at the beginning of the story, at the moment in which the Constitution was enacted. Our country was deeply divided, both politically and culturally. Its economy was a poor one. The civil rights culture was underdeveloped and had been fully eradicated by the fascism. In reaching all these achievements, the Constitution played an important role. It stressed the importance of political parties in a competitive environment. It underlined the importance of cooperation between public and private enterprises, and that cooperation was fundamental during the so-called Italian miracle in the 60s. It protected with powerful legal devices individual and collective liberties, thanking also to the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. As a result, a common political and social identity was forged by the Constitution, and a constitutional patriotism, even if sometimes rhetoric, for the first time appeared in our country and greatly extended through time from the left to the right wing. Also, on purely institutional terms, the Constitution performed much better than the Statuto Albertino did. As Stephen Holmes very brilliantly told us this morning, constitutions usually play two fundamental roles and functions. On one side, they protect against abuse of power. On the other, they create and confer legitimacy to the government. As a whole, the Constitution performed very well in the first sense, I would say. It protected against abuse of political power. This was a very important result, especially in the 50s and in the 60s, when political divisions due to the Cold War were deep and temptations of a military push arose. The Constitution continued to perform pretty well when, at the beginning of the 90s, a more majoritarian democracy and political system was set up. The rigidity devices, as qualified majorities and popular referendum for constitutional changes, protected the Constitution from sudden partisan changes pushed by changes in the political system. Powerful countervailing actors like the Constitutional Court were in action, and vertical separation of powers through region and local authorities became stronger and stronger. This way, the Constitution survived the radical changes in the political system that occurred from the beginning of the 90s, and up to a certain extent succeeded in making those changes coherent with the constitutional system. Moreover, differently perhaps from the US Constitution, the Italian one proved to be not excessively rigid. It allowed the participation of Italy to the European Union and to the Organization of the United Nations, and all the subsequent transformations in the economic and social field that occurred. Many relevant amendments were approved, especially, but not only, in the second part of the Constitution. We may say that the Constitution, on the contrary, worked much worse in the second sense, in the hard job of creating a strong public power, a strong and effective government. The executive, in particular, was kept weak and unstable. So, as Sabino Cassese stressed, while Part 1, that on fundamental principles and rights, led to great developments, Part 2, regarding the organization of the Republic, showed signs of weariness and weakness. According to me, there might be a sort of cause-effect or a trade-off relationship between the success of the first part and the failure, the partial failure of the second. Up to a certain extent, we might say that Italy was governed by its society rather than by its institutions. Collective entities, such as labor unions, trade associations, professional services representative bodies, acted as recognized and protected communities, the so-called formazioni sociali of our Constitution. They created consensus and they distributed welfare among the participants and citizens. They ensured the continuity of public policies that executives couldn't afford. Individual and collective rights were then greatly extended from one social group to the other. The political mediation became, up to a certain extent, unnecessary. Strangely enough, especially during the 80s and the 90s, some social rights were extended through the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. All's well that ends well, then? Not at all, I would say. A failure in the building of an effective government could appear not such an acute problem in the golden age of economic and social development. But the price of that equilibrium of the past was high, and now we are perhaps coming to pay the bill. Pressures from stakeholders and weaknesses of the political actors made public debt level grow to an unprecedented way, also violating the spirit, if not the letter, of Article 81 of the Constitution. We are now entering an age of emergency, an age of economic crisis, an age of scarce resources. Ruling in such a period is not an easy task. In all Western countries, social, economic, and political equilibria of the past are under attack. The idea of a never-ending economic and social growth is under question. The Italian Constitution worked well in the age of wealth. The problem is that the Italian Constitution, as other European countries' constitution, is related to a specific model of social market and industrial economy. It's a typical constitution of the 20th century. From this point of view, the Italian constitution, like the German or the French, is totally different from the US Constitution that experienced a much longer life, due to its much more universal and up to a certain extent out of time flavor. As Guido Calabresi told us a few minutes ago, the US Constitution promised much less, and sometimes relationships based on a lower degree of promises and reciprocal aspirations can last much more. So the problem is, can the Italian Constitution work and perform well in an age of economic depression and social downturn? Will it survive the 20th century challenges? Let's consider what we have to do in future years. Public debt must be strongly cut. Public policies and programs must be reduced. Courageous measures are necessary to enhance competitiveness and to recognize individual skills, especially of younger generations. All these measures require an effective government and a consensus-building capacity. From this point of view, the Constitution reveals all the limits about which Sabino Cassese spoke. Too many veto powers were built up both by the written and the living Constitution. They could block or delay the adoption of policies and measures that are necessary also in the interest of future generations. And secondly, the Constitution fostered a culture of rights rather than a culture of duties. Even the costly rights not protected by the Constitution directly, that were afterwards recognized by the legislator, from free medical assistance for everybody to the ban of discretionary fire in the labor market, are now intended as part of the living Constitution. Nobody is willing to give up with them, and appeal to the Constitution is becoming part of the everyday public discourse. Differently from the past, this happens in a sort of a conservative mood, not in a progressive one as it was in the 60s and in the 70s. We have to face difficult challenges of the new economic and social age that we are entering. All this, according to me, might explain why constitutional renewal, both in values and institutions, might be needed in next years. Thank you.